Hello, everyone. It's about 2 minutes until the start time. Just like we've been doing in the past, we'll actually start 2 minutes after the start time. So we'll be starting at 1:02 p.m. Eastern. But just as a quick reminder to folks that there is a questions box that is available to you. If you do have any questions, please feel free to post those questions in that GoToWebinar questions box, and we'll do our best to answer the questions as we go along. So again, we'll start in about 3 minutes. So 1:02 p.m. Eastern. Thank you. We'll be starting in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last session of the DMARC Bootcamp. Again, my name is Shazad Mears. I'm the Director of Operations. So you've made it through the past 4 weeks. This is the last session. We're basically going to just give a quick review over some of the key points from the last few weeks, just to reiterate and stress a few of the points that we had mentioned, and give you a chance to maybe ask some questions if you would like to ask questions during the session. But then towards the later end of the session, we're actually going to go through and talk about a few other email security mechanisms that are available to you as well, right? So it's not just DMARC, remember, that you need to focus on, right? There's other different types of email authentication and email security mechanisms that you want to actually implement and that you should consider using alongside with DMARC, right? Because you need to have that layered approach when it comes to email. So the first thing is just to focus on some key items, right? So again, remember when it comes to DMARC, right? There's 3 parts to it, right? Which is right in its name, right? Authentication, reporting, and conformance. You need to make sure you have all 3 components lined up, all 3 components being used in order to have this, DMARC working and functioning correctly. But also remember when it came to DMARC, right? There's 2 parts to DMARC, right? There's the DMARC policy. And the DMARC policy is going to be what you as the sending organization needs to create, right? Because that's what's going to define the authentication checks to be used. It's going to define where the reports are supposed to be sent to, and it's going to define what your conformance level is, right? And how the recipient needs to act. So you have to create your DMARC policy. But then remember, you're also a recipient, right? You're also a receiving organization as well. So for that end, you have to have DMARC verification enabled, right? So that's something like you have to turn on, whether it be on your email servers, most likely going to be on your email security gateways. That's where you're going to most likely be turning this on and enabling it and using it, right? So just remember to check to make sure that your systems have that capability available to you, so that way you can have it up and running. In most cases, if you're using a cloud service provider, they'll have the DMARC verification enabled by default, and you don't really have control over it. So it's just turned on, right? And these are the things we're going to focus on. So these other things. So remember, there are, aside from the fact that it's protecting your brand, that it's improving the trust and the integrity of your brand, that the consumer side's already being protected with DMARC verification, right? They have it turned on, right? So your Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo, and so on, they already have DMARC verification. It's really going to be up to you as the organization to make sure that you have the policy in place. So therefore, by doing that, you're actually increasing the chances of deliverability, right? You're making sure that those messages actually get to the consumers, right? Because otherwise, these large email service providers are going to probably block your messages or put them into spam, depending on what type of activity that they're seeing. Right? And that deliverability aspect is very important, right? You want to make sure if you're in like a hospital that the patients are getting the information that they need to get from their doctors, right? If you're a retail store, right, you want to make sure that your marketing material gets to where it needs to get to, right? And each organization is going to have certain aspects and certain critical email that needs to get to the people that they need to get, that the information needs to get to. So that deliverability is obviously going to be very important. And that, so by implementing DMARC, SPF, and DKIM, you're improving deliverability of your messages. And then obviously visibility is going to be very important, right? We talked about this last week, that those reports that are being generated by DMARC are going to give you a whole slew of information that you're going to need to help you determine and guide you on your DMARC journey to get up to an enforcement level. Now remember also, what is DMARC protecting against, right? It's protecting against phishing and spoofing, but it's only doing one particular type, right? In week one, if you remember, we talked about 3 types of spoofing, right? But DMARC is only going to protect against one type, right? So you need to have other mechanisms in place still to protect those other types of spoofing that's out there, right? So DMARC specifically is focusing on domain spoofing or direct domain spoofing, right? So person@company.com. So it's actually using your legitimate domain name when these emails are going out. So you still need to have your spam filters. You still need to have your malware filters and your email cloud security gateways and all the capabilities that they have, right? Those things still need to be in place. DMARC is going to be just one layer that you're putting into your email security infrastructure. Now also remember, where do you create your DMARC policies? You not only get to create it for your public-facing email domains, but you should create it for all public-facing domains, right? So whether that public-facing domain is used for email or not, you need to implement DMARC because you want to prevent others from using or potentially using those domains for fraudulent type of activity. So in emails, in the email world, okay? You know, so if you remember, you know, in week 3, we talked about some ways to do that, right? If you're not using it for the a public, if you have a public domain that's not used for email, you're going to create a DMARC policy of reject, right? Right, you make sure P equals reject, and then have an empty SPF record, right? So V equals SPF1-all, and that's it. You don't need to have a DKIM record because there's nothing that you're going to use to generate the DKIM key. There's nothing used, you're not signing these messages. So therefore, you know, you don't need to create a DKIM signature if you don't want to, or a DKIM public key in any way. So make sure you do this. I mean, that's even just a quick win. It's just to take all of your public domains, figure out which ones don't have email, and just put them all to the policy of reject. Right, so that way you get them all done, you knock them all out, and you don't have to worry about people spoofing those domains. Then you can focus on the ones that actually are used for email with the policy of none and getting the reports and so on and so forth. Now, again, also remember how the entire process works as well, right? Because you have to publish your record in DNS, right? This is where your SPF, your DKIM, and your DMARC records are all going to go onto your public-facing DNS server. right? So you as a sending organization, put that on your public facing DNS server. Which one's your public facing DNS server? That's where your website's information is going to be. This is, your email, MX records and server information are going to be, right? That's where you're going to create it. You're not creating this internally, right? Because if because that's not going to help anyone from on the outside of your organization. Internally, it's also recommended don't have SPF, DKIM, and DMARC internally, because that's just, you're going to probably cause more issues than you need when you're sending internal messages. So always create these on your public facing DNS, right? And also remember, this is completely transparent to the end user, right? I mean, you obviously could tell them, you can inform them about these types of things that are being created or being put into place to help better protect them, but they don't have to do anything special, right? You don't need to install anything special. You don't need to tell them to click this or check this before you hit send. They don't need to do anything. They just do what they need to do, because everything is going on the server side, right? Whether it be your email server or it be your email security gateways that are going to perform the actions, right? Because all the metadata information is going to be put in there, right? With the IP of them, where the message is coming from, is going to be included here, right? The domain information, the DKIM signing is going to happen at this level, right? By these systems. All that's going to happen, and then that's where the email gets sent out to the receiving side. Now remember, for the receiving side, you need to have either so you need to have a DMARC verification enabled, right, to check all incoming messages to see if these messages are protected by DMARC. What is the DMARC policy in place? If DMARC verification is not turned on, then it's going to treat the messages like normal, right? It'll go through all the other filters and whatnot, and then just pass it on accordingly. DMARC verification is enabled, the other filters will still be taken into account, but then it's just going to add the fact, okay, well, there's a DMARC policy, we need to check, does this domain have a DMARC policy associated with it? So that's where it's going to go out to the sending organization system and say, hey, do you guys have a DMARC policy? You don't? Okay, then we'll skip that check. You do? Okay, let's make sure we check SPF. Let's check to see if DKIM exists. Let's perform all those, check everything, and then act accordingly based on your DMARC policy, right? Because that's the key part. If you're set to none, remember, your policy level is none, that's monitored only mode. It's not going to take any DMARC action on those messages. So if it is a fraudulent messages and it happens to bypass all your other filters, the message goes up to the recipient's inbox. Even if it's legitimate, it'll still go to the recipient's inbox, right? But the idea is to get to quarantine and reject for your conformance levels, so that way now you have DMARC enforcement in place, right? Because if none of the checks pass, so all the checks fail, everything goes into quarantine. If it's your quarantine, it goes into the spam junk folder. If it's at reject, the message is completely dropped. So those are things that are going to matter. But then also remember where the reports are coming from, right? The reports are coming from the receiving side, right? Because they're the ones who are going to know what's going on with your domain. They're the ones who can tell you what happened with SPF, what happened with DKIM, right? They can tell you the IP address that's sending the information using your domain name. So whether it be legitimate servers or fraudulent servers, right? Because they're the ones who are going to see that activity, not your sending server, right? Because the sending server is going to say, okay, well, we sent it. We know that much. Unless you have like a read receipt or something like that, you may not know whether the message actually got delivered or not, right? So those are things that you have to take into account and things you need to take into consideration. So that's why those DMARC reports are going to be very important. Will all the receiving side send reports? No, not everyone is going to send you reports, but the majority of the people do actually send you those reports. Then remember, when you're creating your DMARC record, you're creating a TXT record inside of DNS, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's Windows, Linux, or it's a cloud service provider or cloud hosting provider, right? You're going to create a TXT record. And then you're going to always make sure that the name of that record is going to be _ DMARC, right? _ DMARC. It has to start with that. You need the underscore as well. Okay. Do you have to put the domain name afterwards? No, you don't have to, right? Because in Windows, we showed you in week 3 of Windows, Bind, and the cloud service providers, you didn't have to add the domain name at the end, right? But just be careful, because there might be a few out there, that in terms of cloud service providers and in Linux, depending on where you put the record, you may have to add the domain name. But then remember also the value is also always going to, the value is going to be the same. no matter what, right? But I mean, yes, the values of each tag might be different, but otherwise these are the tags you're going to use. Now, the other key part is when it comes to the value aspect of it, remember, every single tag has to be separated with that semicolon, right? That's very important. That's very critical because that's good. Otherwise, you can cause issues with your policy. Right, I'm not going to go through all the tags again. This is just to remind you about that we have all of these tags that are present. Remember the ones that you need to at least have, right? V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals, and the policy level. Those two you have to have. That's the order it goes in. The V tag first, and then the P tag, and then after that, you can put the tags in whichever order you would like to put them in. But the V tag and then the P tag. Right, I mean, I've seen people put them out of order, meaning they put the V tag first and they put RUA or the FO tag or something else, and they put the P tag as the third one or the fourth one. Yeah, you could technically get away with that, but not all verification systems, so not all DMARC verification systems are going to recognize your policy, right? Because they're typically looking for the P tag to be second. If they see it as third or fourth, they may ignore it. So that's why it's highly recommended the V tag first, then the P tag second, and then after that, you can put them in whatever order that you want. Right, so these are the tags. And then, so RUA, we're saying is required, but technically it's not required, right? But we're saying it's required because if you just put in the V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals none, semicolon, and that's it, what have you done? Yeah, you created a DMARC policy, but it's not doing anything. Right? And you have no way of finding out whether you're ready to go to quarantine or reject, right? You have to use the RUA tag in order to start the generation of those reports. Without the RUA tag, you will not get any reports, okay? And the RUF tag. So the RUA is the one that we're saying that you need to get because that has the most information in it. The RUF tags is up to you. And we do recommend putting it in, but it's up to you whether you want to use those or not. Then remember all the remaining tags that are here, if you don't use them, they have a default value, right? So if you don't explicitly define it, it will default to the original setting. So FO equals 0 is the one for that one. ADChem equals R, ASPF equals R, PCT equals 100, RF equals ARFR, RI equals 86,400, right? And then the SP tag, if you don't define it, it uses the P tag setting. Right? So, but SP tag is the one we're saying that you should consider using. Why? Because the SP tag is where it applies to the subdomains, right? Because the P tag applies to the top level in the subdomains, but then you consider using the SP tag for one of two cases. There might be some other one, but these are the two main cases. One is that if you do not have subdomains and your P tag is set to none, then that's where you can put in SP equals reject. So that way you're protecting all your subdomains, even ones that you don't have, right? So even if you don't have subdomains that are publicly facing, you're preventing people from using any type of subdomain for your domain. So that's why you want to put in SP equals reject. So you're protecting that, and you can do whatever you need the analysis that you're still doing at the top level domain. Or if you have subdomains with email capabilities, that's where you put in SP equals none, right? You put in SP equals none, and then you can adjust your P tag to quarantine and reject, and then at each subdomain, you put their own SPF, put their own DKIM, and put their own DMARC policy in place. All right. Now remember also with DMARC doesn't technically have authentication built into it, right? It does have the alignment aspect, which we'll talk about in a bit, but DMARC is using other mechanisms to do the authorization and authentication and meet those requirements. So it's using these pre-existing mechanisms. So sender policy framework and domain keys identified mail. So these are two things that you should have in place in order to get DMARC to function correctly and work appropriately. Do you have to have both? No, you don't have to have both. We do recommend that if you can do both, do both. But at minimum, you have to have one or the other, but they have to be fully functional in order for it to work properly, right? So SPF, that's going to be your list of IPs and domains that are allowed to send using your domain name, and DKIM is that digital signature that you're adding at the server level, right? So when message gets sent out from that system is the one that's doing the signing. But remember, right, SPF and DKIM have their own flaws if you're using them by themselves. Right, so now when it comes to SPF, remember with SPF must always start with V equals SPF1, and it must always end with either dash all or tilde all, but that all tag needs to be at the end. Okay, because right, the dash all is to define a hard fail, and the tilde all is defining a soft fail. So that's just defining, how strict you're being with what's in the list for the SPF. So remember, SPF is the only one that uses the all tag, right? DMARC doesn't use the all tag in any way. Okay. You can only have one record for SPF. So one per domain. So if you have subdomains and they need their own SPF because they send mail on their own, that's fine. But the SPF is unique to that one domain. Other things to remember with SPF is the 10 domain lookup issue. Right? You can't have more than 10 domains listed in your SPF because it's going to cause issues. It actually gets ignored. Anything after the 10th one gets ignored. So what you can do is you have those different options that you have, right? You have flattening, where you can convert the domains to IPs. But the problem with that is that if you don't control or have control over those IPs, you could potentially lead to issues. You could do dynamic or instant SPF, which is where you're using a third-party vendor and having them handle all your SPF, right? Because they're going to use different regex capabilities and macro expressions and so on that they'll build for you. Right, but then you also have with other options where you have to take into consideration, well, is that top level domain actually using that for mail, or is it a subdomain? Because if it's a subdomain, then put that, instead of putting it at the top level, put at the subdomain level, right? This is why you need to really consider at the subdomain level that's being used for email, just create the SPF records on their own, create their own SPF, create their own DKIM, and create their own DMARC policy. You don't have to put everything at the top level. Right, and then the other thing you want to take into consideration is that the include statement, right? Do you really need to have all those different marketing tools or CRM tools, right? Do you need to really have Salesforce and HubSpot? Do you really need to have MailChimp, Constant Contact, and HubSpot, right? You maybe want to consider visiting the time at this point. Maybe we need to reduce the number of marketing tools that you're using. But then also don't forget about SPF in terms of the two parts to it as well, right? There's SPF verification and there's SPF alignment, right? Because those are two different things. You can pass SPF verification, but you can fail alignment, and then therefore DMARC is going to fail, right? So you have to make sure those things are set up correctly. So remember, for SPF alignment, this is from week 2, right? What's being compared for alignment? It's the from domain with the return path domain. Okay, those are the two things that are being compared. SPF verification, what's being checked there is to see, is that return path domain, what is it? And is the message coming from a system that's authorized for that particular domain in the return path, right? So that's why, a lot of times when you look at your DMARC reports, you'll see SPF is passing, but you'll see SPF alignment is failing. And the reason is that SPF is still passing because of the domain that it's coming from, right? Because if you look at the second one in the return path, it's a completely different domain, but that's the domain that's being looked up for SPF verification, right? So if you want DMARC to pass for SPF, you need to make sure that SPF is aligned. You want to make sure the from domain matches the return path domain. And that's where, again, with third-party vendors, you're going to see this issue the most. Right, because not all third-party vendors are able to set up SPF to have the domains match, right? They still use their own servers. But if you can get them to match, that's great. Try to do that as best as you can, but you're not always going to get that with some of these third-party vendors. And that's why DKIM is going to be critical as well, because if you can get DKIM set up correctly, the majority of the time I've seen DKIM will always always use your domain, because they're able to set it up in a way so that it uses your domain. So that's why you want to try to have DKIM. So even if you have SPF set up, but it's not aligning, at least if you can get DKIM alignment and DKIM verification to pass, then overall for DMARC, it's going to pass. Now also remember with DKIM that this is using PKI, right? There's a private key and a public key, right? Whether you generated the keys or you have your third-party vendor give you the information for these keys, right? But the key part is that protect your private key, right? So make sure it's somewhere safe, secure, and that the system can access it, so that way the signing can happen. And then you publish your public key, right? So whether it be the TXT record or the CNAME record you're creating, the CNAME record is not actually going to be the public key, but it's going to point to the domain that holds your public key. The TXT record is going to be the actual public key. And you can have more than one DKIM record, right? You should technically have DKIM for each system that's being used to send mail, right? So if you have your own internal systems and you have your email security gateway, that should be at least one, right? Because your Iron Ports or Mimecast should have DKIM signing capability. So there should be one DKIM record for that, right? Office 365 uses 2. Google G Suites uses 1, right? Salesforce uses 1, but you can create more than 1 if you choose to. Right, so it's going to depend on what you're using and how many of those. If you can get them all to set up DKIM for all of them, then do so. And definitely use it, have DKIM in place if you're using a cloud service provider. Right, and the reason why is, again, what I mentioned with SPF, right? Because if the alignment is off for SPF, and SPF is going to be using like, _spf.google.com or spf.protection.outlook.com, right? That means anyone within that same cloud service provider could technically use your domain, right? They can still technically spoof it because it's still coming from a legitimate location. But DKIM is going to be that additional layer that you're going to add to provide protection, right? And then alignment versus verification also applies to DKIM, right? There's a difference between the two. And remember, this is where we're looking at that, again, the message headers. So the from address, right? The from domain needs to match the domain in the DKIM signature. So as long as both of those match, then your DKIM is aligned, right? DKIM verification is just going to look at the DKIM signature, find the domain in the DKIM signature, and then look up that domain for the DKIM public key and see if they can find the public key for that. And that's why it'll always pass. And I shouldn't say always, but in most cases, it's going to pass. Right, but the key part is, in order for DMARC to work, you want everything to align, everything to pass. You want the domain to match, and and then now that's where your DKIM is passing now. So remember now, if you can get DKIM passing and SPF is still failing, DMARC overall is going to still allow this to be a pass. Right, so you don't have to have both functional. As long as you have one fully passing, you're good. So this is, can you use wildcards with third-party server names? For example, MailChimp had 3 servers, but all are close in name. No, you can't use wildcards with SPF. MailChimp will actually give you what you need to add into your SPF record. So that's what you need to make sure you add. They'll give you the include statement. So I forget what exactly it is, but it's include, and then they give you the domain that you need to put in. That domain is going to encompass all their servers. So make sure for third parties, follow suit what they give you. Don't just look at their SPF or look at their MX records. Follow their directions. Look up their directions, go into their facts, go into their help guides. They're going to tell you exactly what to put in and what to do. Now, again, also remember with DNS, right? So again, DMARC, only 1 per domain, right? So 1 per domain. That doesn't, so remember again, the top level domain, if you just use the P tag, automatically applies to all the subdomains. And that's where you get the SP tag to come into play. SPF, 1 record per domain as well. Right, and then remember, DMARC, you got to give it a name of _DMARC for SPF. You don't need to give it a name. Right, I mean, depending on the system that you use, you may have to put the @ symbol in there because the @ symbol represents a blank or a null. Right, or you just completely leave that field blank and you should be fine. But it will tell you. So your DNS system will tell you if there's an issue. DKIM, right? You can have multiple records, but the key thing with DKIM, it must start with a selector ._domain key and then your domain name. What's the selector? Again, that depends on what you define it to be. So the selector, if you're creating your own keys, so if you're creating your own keys, your selector can be whatever you want, right? Like Google uses TXT records, so they by default use Google as the selector, but they give you the option to change it. And we do recommend that you change it. Don't just use Google _. Name it to something, change the selectors to something else. But like Office 365, right? They tell you, no, this is what the selector is going to be. Selector 1 _ domain key, selector 2 _ domain key. That's what you have to use. It's not an option, right? So if the third-party provider gives you the DKIM information, that's what you use. You can't pick and choose your own at that point. And the DKIM records must be unique, right? So you can't have two selector 1 _ domain keys, because that's going to cause a conflict. It's going to cause an issue, right? Because when the receiving side sees, oh, the domain, the selector is selector 1 for this domain, but we see 2 records, which one is the one we're supposed to check against, right? So the DKIM selector must be unique per system. For Linux, remember where you're placing the records, right? Because if you have that $origin in the domain name, right, anything after that, it automatically appends the domain name, so you don't have to type out the fully qualified domain name. However, if it goes before that line, you do have to type out the fully qualified domain name. The other thing with the requirement with Linux is just it needs quotation marks, right? Because DMARC and then even DKIM, right, it uses semicolons to to say where the end of that particular tag is, right? But remember, in Linux, when you use semicolons in bind, anything after the semicolon is considered a comment, right? So it's a comment, so that means that it's not something that's used as part of the system. So it ignores everything after the semicolons if you forget to put in those quotation marks. So on a Linux machine, make sure you have those quotation marks in place. There might be some cloud service providers that you may need to put the quotation marks in as well. Again, it will tell you whether you need it. It'll error out. If it doesn't, if it accepts it, in most cases, it'll just automatically add the quotation marks for you, right? Because like I showed, if those who attended in week 3, right, in Google Cloud DNS, it gave me an error if I didn't put the quotation marks. It actually warned me when I was typing it out, make sure you put the quotation marks in. But when I went to Ionis one-on-one, I could just type it out and it automatically was adding the quotation marks for me. So I didn't have to put them in myself. So just be wary of that. That you put all these DNS systems, you may or may not need the fully qualified domain. You may or may not need those quotation marks, right? But then you'll know whether it will need that. The system should hopefully tell you what's going on in there. But remember, 2 report types, right? So that's as long as the receiving side has DMARC verification enabled and they choose to send you reports. It also matters the fact that you have your RUA and RUF tags. If you exclude those 2 tags in your policy, you will not get reports, right? You will not get those reports. Remember, when you put this in, you're putting in RUA equals mail to the email address that the reports are going to get sent to, semicolon, RUF equals mail to colon, the email address you're sending it to, semicolon, right? And it goes anywhere after the P tag. So V tag first, P tag, semicolon, then you can put RUF first and then RUA, or you can go RUA and then RUF. That doesn't matter. Okay, but that's the important part, is to have those in. And which ones do you really want to see RUA? Because that's the one that's going to tell you all that information, right? The RUA reports are going to be the ones that are going to show you within a certain period of time what are the IP addresses that are using your domain name, fraudulent or legitimate. It's going to show you both, right? Because again, the receiving side should be able to see that information and can report that back to you, right? It's going to tell you about SPF. Did SPF pass or fail? What domain was being used for SPF? Did SPF align? Did it fail align? Right? Same thing with DKIM. Did it pass, fail DKIM checks? What domain was being used for DKIM? And did DKIM alignment pass or fail? And then it'll tell you your DMARC settings. It'll tell you if your DMARC policy was overridden by the receiving side. all that kind of information is going to be in there for the agri reports, right? So the agri reports are the ones that are going to be that zipped file with the XML attachment. Sorry, the zipped attachment with an XML document inside that zipped attachment, right? How many are you going to get on a daily basis? It's hard to say. It really depends on how much email you're sending out and how many domains you're actually sending them out to. And then also whether those receiving domains, whether they have DMARC enabled or they don't have it enabled. And also then what your reporting interval is going to be, right? The default is 24 hours, but if you lower it, you may get reports sooner than the 24 hours. Right, so RUA and RUF tag, P equals none, semicolon RUA equals and semicolon RUF equals. Now, you can still leave the reporting mechanism enabled during quarantine and your reject phases. You don't have to turn it on. We actually recommend you continue leaving it, because then that way you can come back to those reports and say, hey, you know, someone says or complains, hey, these messages weren't being delivered or something happened. You can check the DMARC reports and say, okay, well, did DMARC have any, was DMARC one of the causes to it, or maybe it was something else that caused it. Right, plus then it also gives you control of your assets, right? Because once you're at reject, right, people now actually have to come to you before they can go out and buy something like MailChimp or HubSpot or something like that. They have to come to you as the IT admin or email admin and say, well, we're getting this new system to send emails. Can we do this? And then you can go through your whole business case and whatnot and requirements, so that way they go through the right process instead of just buying things without talking to IT. So right, you have all this stuff in place. What's next? Get those reports, review those reports, adjust SPF and DKIM as needed for all those legitimate systems, right? The ones that you found and you know are legitimate, make those adjustments so that way when you go to reject or quarantine, you don't have issues with those systems. Right, during this process, apply P equals reject to all the public domains that are not being used for email, right? Create the blank SPF record with V equals SPF1-all, and then put in the DMARC policy of reject. And hopefully within a couple of weeks, if not sooner, you can get up to quarantine or reject. But keep reviewing those reports, because ultimately you want to try your best to get up to reject if you can. Right, and then those reports are going to tell you, so that way when you're getting a new mail system comes up, you can send test messages through it, check the reports and say, okay, this is not, well, it's not passing DMARC, so we need to make these adjustments, make those adjustments, and then hopefully you can say, okay, after a few test messages were sent out, things are working correctly, we can go ahead and use this system like we need to use. Right, but then also remember, right, DMARC is not your stopgap, right? DMARC is not your silver bullet when it comes to phishing, when it comes to email email security. You want to make sure you have other mechanisms in place still, right? Still have your malware protection mechanisms, still have your spam and anti-phishing mechanisms in place, right? Still have content filtering and so on. Still have those things in place. You need those because those are going to help prevent against other types of attacks. Right, and other types of phishing and other types of spoofing. Right, so DMARC is just going to be your one layer of your email security infrastructure. Right, and so what are some of these other mechanisms that we have? Some of these you heard us talk about over the last few weeks as well. Right, so SPF, DKIM, and DMARC are obviously the three that we talked about the most. But then there's other ones like ARC and BIMI, which you can use alongside with these three to help enhance it or help protect your organization. Now, do you need to have them? That's really up to you. Like ARC, for example. ARC stands for Authenticated Received Chain. Not every organization needs to use ARC. How do you know whether you should? Well, the question ends up being is, do you have a mail list server? Do you have mail forwarding systems? Because if you have those two, then yeah, you're going to need to consider using Authenticated Received Chain. Because authenticated receipt, because what happens with any SPF or DKIM or DMARC, doesn't matter if you use all three or just one of the two, whenever you pass your message on to another system, and then that system forwards it off to another group of people, like on mailing lists, right? So you send a mail to a listserv, then a listserv sends it out to everybody else. All these authentication mechanisms are going to break, right? Even if you just use SPF, even if you use just DKIM, right? Because what's the originator now? Right? Because when you send it to the listserv, now the listserv is now the originating system, right? So it doesn't conserve by default those the original SPF or the original DKIM or the original DMARC. So this is why they create authenticated receive change, because the idea and concept behind it is to preserve email authentication. So it encapsulates that information, the SPF, DKIM, and DMARC information, so that way it's kept when it goes. So that way when it goes on to the next hop, then at that point they're going to say, okay, well, yes, there's ARC, but oh wait, look, there's this other information here from where the message actually originated from. So again, not everybody needs to do this. Only certain people need to do this. It's only people who have mail forwarding type systems or mail list servers. Those are the only people that need to have ARC in place. All right. So I like email service providers, universities, because universities have a lot of mail list servers for the students or faculty. So we see those in those situations. So that's where ARC comes into play for those areas. So arc-specs.org, that's the site to go to get more information about ARC. They have a great working group where you can ask them questions and they can help you go through the process of implementing ARC if you need it, or they can give you alternatives. So if ARC is not the solution for what you're looking for, then maybe they've been great about giving you alternative options as well. There are multiple tools. One tool I just pointed out here is OpenARC. Is one tool that you could consider using if you need to implement ARC. So a lot of people are supporting it. So Google is supporting it, Yahoo Mail, Yahoo Groups supporting it. I think Microsoft has started supporting it. So a lot of the service providers are starting to support this as well. BIMI, so brand indicators for message identification. So what this is doing is that if you look in, and this is really more right now in terms of functionality, it's more on the client side. So meaning like the Gmails and Yahoo side. So when you get your email and you open up the email, there's like a little icon next to the person's email or next to the person's name that kind of shows you like either an initial or it's blank or a question mark. What BIMI is going to do is that when you define an image that's associated with your organization, you can have your image appear in that location and where that icon is. Right, so the image of your choice. This is our valid image that we want. This is the one that needs to appear. Right, so now can anyone just put an image in there? Yeah, but there are validators, right? So like Google and Yahoo are using validators to make sure that those are verified images. So there's few level of requirements, right? One requirement is that in order to implement BIMI, you do need to have a DMARC policy of reject or quarantine. Otherwise, your BIMI record is not accepted. The other aspect is that not only do you have to create a TXT record, right? So like you see the example there of default._BIMI. If you downloaded the slide deck, there was an error on this slide. You need to find the value of B equals BIMI1 semicolon L equals the location of where the image file is. But then the part in the slide deck that was on our site is semicolon A equals. That's missing. So A equals define the location of a certificate file, right? So you actually have to have a validated certificate that's associated with that image, right? Otherwise, this is not going to be considered legitimate or a verified image, right? So you actually have a process to go through and to get that certificate. It's not easy to get that certificate, aside from the cost aspect of it, right? You have to define an image. That image needs to be trademarked, right? So you can't just pick any, you have to pick a trademarked image. That's one of the requirements currently, right? Then the other aspect is once you have that image, you have to submit that image in order to be authorized and associated with a certificate, right? And in order to get that certificate, it's not like you go just any site and buy an SSL certificate, right? There's only 2 vendors right now, right? So I believe it's DigiCert and Entrust Data Card are the only 2 right now that allow you to buy or purchase a verified markup certificate is what they call it, a verified markup certificate. And you have to supply quite a good deal of information, and then you also have to provide proof of who you are. So valid proof. So you actually have to submit a valid ID, right? So like passport, a driver's license, right? And you actually do have a video call with the person from those organizations to verify who you are, right? To make sure that your face matches what's on your license or on your passport. And they do not expire. They do not accept expired passports. I found that out. My passport ended up being expired 3 days after the time I got a meeting to get the verification, and I didn't realize it. But either way, those are things they actually do go through a full verification process. Will that change? I don't know, because this is still going through the pilot. They're still solidifying things, but they're doing whatever it takes to make sure that those certificates can't just be issued to anyone, right? Because if an attacker or a hacker wants to get these certificates, they're not just buying it, right? They have to actually show their face. They have to associate with a domain. They have to have a valid DMARC policy in place. So that domain will have to live for a period of time. So it makes them an easier target, right? They're easier to find now at that point. So that's why you don't see attackers going right after this. The image file itself has to be an SVG file. So it's a particular type of image that is requirements, and there are size requirements for these images as well. But again, for more information, there's bimigroup.org, right? That's the authenticators group that they're the ones who are developing, going through the process. Right now, Google and Yahoo are going through a pilot phase. Yahoo's been doing it for the past 2 or 3 years. Google has been doing it for the past year, I believe, or six months or a year. So eventually, at some point in time, these are going to go into effect. But you can always get started right away and not have to wait until it actually goes in place. You can put all the records you need to put into place. There's also bimi.agari.com as well that you can go there. Also on the DMARC Bootcamp resources page, last week we had a session from Seth Blank, who works for ValueMail, but he's also the chair of the Authenticators Work Group. He gave a full presentation on BIMI, all the different parts of it, different aspects of it, and people asked a lot of great questions. We recorded that session and we made that recording available on the DMARC Bootcamp resource page. So you can see it there, and if you want to watch it, you can watch it at any point in time as you choose. So that's available there. I do encourage you to watch it. He provided a lot of great information and a lot of great resources as well. So now both of these ARC and BIMI are reliant on SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, right? So BIMI, you have to have DMARC, right? DMARC, you need SPF and DKIM. For ARC, you need to have one of the three, if not all three, right? Now, these next two I'm going to talk about do not require you to have DMARC, SPF, or DKIM. These are standalone mechanisms, right? And the first one is DANE for SMTP. So DANE stands for DNS-based authentication of named entities. And what this is using, it's using DNS for a level of authentication to make sure that the servers that are communicating, the mail servers that are communicating with each other, are actually establishing an encrypted TLS connection between those two systems, right? So that way you're not solely relying on star TLS or for that, but you're having an additional layer of authentication as well, right? So this is where it's using DNS to do that. Specifically within DNS, right? It's using DNSSEC, so Domain Name System Security Extension. Right, because with DNSSEC, you have to have a valid certificate, so an X.509 digital certificate, in order to do it. Because you can't just do DNSSEC. There has to be validation. There has to be things taken into account. Your registrar has to accept the capability of allowing for DNSSEC-based records as well. Right, so that way you're not just using star TLS as one form of verification, but you're also using DNSSEC as another source of verification. So therefore, it's enhancing the communication or the encryption between the two systems, mail system. So what it's overall is preventing is man in the middle type of attacks. Right, so that's one example of something that's getting prevented by using something like DANE. But again, things to consider with DANE is that, does your registrar support DNSSEC? Not everyone does, or some of them do, but they don't provide you with the DNSSEC information. You have to supply that information to them, and then they will create the records for you, or you can, depending on some of them, will actually allow you to create the records on your own. But in the majority of cases, you actually have to supply them the records, and then they create the records for you. The other question is does your email service provider support DNSSEC? Which most of them are starting to support DNSSEC, but not all of them do. And then you obviously need to create the appropriate DNS records, right? So it's not your standard TXT CNAME type records. You're creating a DS record. So there's more different unique records now that you're creating. So Dane has gained support. It's gained support by Microsoft. Dane is quite widely used in the EU region. It's quite popular in that area. So we do see a lot of people like the Netherlands and Germany, I believe, France, and some other countries in the EU are using Dane quite widely. And a good source for Dane is internet.nl, right? Internet.nl. They have a lot of great information when it comes to setting up Dane, setting up DNSSEC, and so on. Right, so can Dane be implemented without doing DMARC? Yes. Dane is not reliant on DMARC in any way, right? So DMARC is not a requirement. Dane is completely separate and completely different setup process than DMARC is. So yeah, so Dane does not need DMARC in order to function. But it is strongly recommended to have DMARC in place and to have Dane in place as well. So the site name was internet.nl, N as in Nancy and L as in Larry. So it's .Netherlands, NL. Then there's also MTSTS. So MTSTS actually does what Dane does, except the implementation is different. So MTSTS stands for Mail Transfer Agent Strict Transport Security, right? So what this is also doing, right, enables your mail service providers to receive TLS secure SMTP connections. But like Dane, right, Dane requires DNSSEC. MTSTS requires you to have a web server with a certain host name and with a valid SSL certificate, right? And that's why a lot of people tend to lean towards MTSTS, because that's a little bit easier to set up and a little bit easier to go through the process. Right, but MTSTS and Dane, the responsibility, the actions are pretty much are going to be the same. It's just how you do the implementation, right? Because if you run into issues with DNSSEC, right, and DNSSEC, you got to also remember DNSSEC is not globally used either. Whereas, you know, mail server, that's a little bit more widely used. Can you have both MTA and STS and Dane? Yeah, you can actually do both, and they won't conflict with each other. Does it require DMARC? No, this doesn't require DMARC either. Right, but the ultimate goal is to enable domains to achieve two specific things. One, to opt into robust transport layer security, and two, to securely communicate what their MX server should be. Right, because the file you're defining in MTSTF is saying that these are our mail servers for this domain. These are the MX records that we use. And then supply the RFC in case you want to read the RFC. So things to consider with MTA-STS, you must have a valid SSL certificate, right? So you have to have one that's associated with your domain. You need to create the appropriate DNS TXT records, right? So the name _ MTA-STS, value be equals STS version 1, semicolon, then the ID equals, and then unique ID. So it's to be numbers with a semicolon, right? And then on top of that, not only are you creating a DNS records, you also have to have a text file in the appropriate location. And that text file is where you're defining what your MX records are, right? It's not telling you to go look at the MX records. You actually flat out say what the MX records are. And the file has to be in a specific location. That file location has to be HTTPS, right? It has to be HTTPS because you have to have a valid SSL certificate. MTA-STS dot your domain / well-known well-known / MTA-STS.txt. So if you want to look up ours, we actually have one up and running. So you can go to MTA-STS.globalcyberalliance.org / well-known / MTA-STS.txt, and you can see our MTA-STS.txt file, right? And you can see what we have there. That again, so any changes that you make to that file, the DNS TXT record has to be updated. So that value, that number in the ID, you have to adjust the ID, So that's a key thing, because then people tend to forget about that. And then if you forget to change the ID, things will break. And then for reporting and mechanisms, MTSDS uses TLS reporting. So TLS RPT for the reports that are generated, right? So MTSDS is a little bit newer than DANE. DANE's been around much longer. MTSDS has gained more traction because I believe last year Google said that they were going to support it. So that's why it gained a little bit more traction. Now with TLS reporting, TLS RPT, that's what you want to enable, and that's what's going to allow you to know if the secure transfer of email to the domain. So what's going on with that? Is it passing or failing? It's a very basic report. It's not as detailed as the things like the DMARC report. It just really tells you how many passed, how many failed. And that's about on which domain is supporting it. And not too many domains, like we have it set up, but I've mainly seen it from Google and Comcast, were the two main reporting domains that I've seen activity from. I haven't seen it from any other ones. So just take that into account. So DANE and MTSDS, people are slowly adopting it as well. And all you need for TLS reporting is you just need to create that TXT record in DNS, right? _SMTP._TLS. And then the value of V equals TLS RPT version 1. So V1 semicolon, and then just look, the rest of this look familiar. RUA equals, right? Mail to colon, and then the email address you want to send the email to. And those are the only two tags, the V and RUA. So those are two, like again, so DANE is something you can go through the process. MTSDS, you can go through the process. Google has a nice layout on how you can do it if you're using Google G Suites. There's a lot of great references online that you can use to learn how to do both of those and how to set up both of them. But again, remember, these don't require DMARC, ARC, BIMI, or anything like that. This is what you're going to use to help further protect the email ecosystem by putting these in, helping prevent things like man-in-the-middle attacks and things like that. So just to wrap up, so resources. So there's a lot of great resources out there. So all these are available on the Bootcamp resources page. So DMARC.org, they're the creators of DMARC, right? They're the ones who went through the process of putting it together. A lot of great information on there. But then, of course, here at Global Cyber Alliance, we provide you with a great deal of information, right? We have the Bootcamp resources page. We have the DMARC website. We have a YouTube channel where there's a lot of information as well. So we have other videos other than the Bootcamp videos. So how to implement DMARC, SPF DKIM using Salesforce, using MailChimp, using Office 365. I hope to have some more up soon, like the one for G Suite, one for some other systems if I can get my hands on them. And then also we have our community forum, right? So if you do have any questions, you can email us directly, obviously. But if I'm out or we can't get back to you quickly, you can always post a community forum. The community forum is not just GCA staff. We have a lot of subject matter experts that are helping us out on the community forum as well, from other organizations that can give you a lot of information and help you guide you as well. So things to look for in these next, so technically this Friday, which is the 15th or 16th, is technically the end of the boot camp, but just because the boot camp ends doesn't mean that we're going to stop helping you. Email us at any point in time. We're here to help you with throughout the entire, as much as we can with your DMARC journey. I mean, worst case is there might be a point in time when we say, okay, maybe we need to bring in an outside vendor to help you out, but we're going to try to get you started and get you going as much as we can. Things to look out for the survey email. So we're going to send you a survey about the bootcamp as a whole. We do look at that. We do value the information, good or bad, because we've made a lot of adjustments based on past feedback for the boot camps. And we're trying our best to make the adjustments to make this a better experience for the next boot camp and the people who join the next boot camp. So please fill that survey out. And as long as you've attended all 5 sessions to the full extent, you'll get, I believe we're giving extra credit if you fill out the survey as well. But again, you're not going to get that certificate. So the certificate of completion, you only get to get the certificate as long as you attended all 5 sessions, so all 5 weeks to the full extent. Then you're going to get the certificate of completion. The survey is just an additional. And then if you've implemented DMARC between September 14th and October 15th, you'll get an additional 3 credits. All right, so take that into account. So it's got to be closed of business Eastern time on Friday. Technically, I'm going to run the scan on Saturday, but yeah, but that's when we're going to see. I'm going to see who has implemented DMARC and not. If you implemented DMARC before the bootcamp started, that's not going to count. It's only if you've had no policy when we started on September 14th, and then you implemented DMARC at whatever level, but you also have implemented DMARC correctly, right? So if you just put in DMARC equals DMARC 1 semicolon P equals non-semicolon, we're not considering that correct. You need that RUA tag for us to consider it correct. Also expect the certificates within about a 2-week period, right? Because we want to give out those survey, allow people time to fill out that survey, and then after that we'll send. So within about 2 weeks, you should be seeing and being able to get those certificates. If after 2 weeks you don't see a certificate, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll let you know what's going on or if there's a delay. In case you're interested in any other GCA projects, or you like to participate or give us feedback on some of these, we have our cybersecurity toolkit. We have the small businesses and elections. This week, I believe we're pushing out our journalist toolkit as well. So you could feel free to check those out, gcatoolkit.org. And they also have a project called AID, in which we're working on IoT systems. So we basically have honeypots set up mimicking different IoT devices. We have data that we're collecting. We're allowing researchers to access that information and do analysis on that information to help better what's going on with IoT and all these smart devices, and making sure we can see what's going on and what kind of issues are out there. So I think I see a few questions which I didn't answer, so I am going to answer those questions because technically we started 2 minutes late, so I'll go 2 minutes over. But if you cannot stay, thank you for attending the DMARC Bootcamp. I hope we provide you with enough information to get you started on your journey. But again, just because the bootcamp has ended doesn't mean you can't reach out to us. Please feel free to reach out to us, ask the questions to help you get started. We'll help you as best as we can and get you going and get you moving along. So feel free to reach out. We're here. We're not going anywhere, except maybe on holidays. But please do not hesitate, because it's better to ask the question rather than putting in something wrong and potentially breaking your email systems or preventing legitimate emails from going out. So let me go through some of these questions to get those. So if you can't attend, again, thank you. You'll get, as long as you attended from the beginning to now, you'll get the full credit. Can you have multiple values in a DKIM text file in DNS? Yeah. So you can have multiple DKIM records in your DNS. So like for GCA, I think we have we're probably at like 6 or 7 at this point. So you can have multiple DKIM records in your DNS. Yes, that is possible. I see the request for QuickBooks. I will see what I can do, because I think we're getting our hands on that. So if I can get my hands on it as well, then I will see what I can do. Yeah, so reports is typically ends up being the sticking point for a lot of people. What I again recommend is enable reporting. We gave you some free tools and some options last week. If you can pick your tools and then you have questions on that, feel free to reach out to us, right? We'll help you interpret those reports once you've figured out the tool that you want to use, right? We'll help you out. We'll help you interpret it so that we get you in the right directions, what kind of things to look for and what kind of things to do. We've helped multiple people with that, and I'm happy to help out with that as well. So feel free to reach out once you find your reporting tool, and we can help you try to figure out those reports and interpret those reports as well. So that is the last question that I see. So again, thank you everyone. Thank you for your time. Good luck, and we're here to help as best as we can along with your email journey. All right. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day, your rest of your evening, and I hope to hear from a lot of you and with a lot of DMARC questions. So, oh, here's a quick question. So for multiple DKIM keys, how to manage rotation? That's a great question. The recommendation in terms of the DMARC RFC is to go with a 30, 60, or 90-day period. My recommendation is that if you have a PKI type policy where you have like a rotation of keys and so on, follow that, use that, and that way you're consistent, right? Just add DKIM to your list. Now the thing is, with some third-party providers, you're not going to be able to do the rotation, right? Some of them, they basically handle the keys for you and they take care of everything for you. Like Office 365 allows you to rotate the keys. G Suite is TXT based, so you can decide whenever you want to change up the key, just go in and change the key, right? GCA, we do it on a yearly basis. We rotate those keys, but at least the ones that we have control over, we rotate those on a yearly basis. So that way it doesn't cause too much chaos and too many problems. Also remember, do it on a weekend or doing it late Friday night, so that way it doesn't impact DNS too much. All right. Again, thank you, everyone. Feel free to email us any questions that you may have or post those questions to the community forum. And I look forward to hearing from many of you and hopefully can help you out with your DMARC journey.